Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with my May wrap-up. So as usual, this will be filmed in two parts, and I had a really great reading month, a lot of 4 stars and up, so this whole getting back into mood reading thing has been treating me very well. The first book I finished was Snow and Rose by Emily Winfield Martin. Shout out to my friend Shelby for kindly gifting this to me for Christmas. I absolutely loved it. This is a fairy tale retelling of the Snow White and Rose Red fairy tale, and Snow and Rose are 2 sisters, and after some tragedy in their family, they're forced to move away from the city and from their beautiful house to live in this cottage in the woods. And the woods are this kind of magical, a little bit creepy, nobody really understands them kind of situation. And this book is about their adventures there. They make friends with the boy who lives there, and this whole time Snow and Rose are trying to figure out what happened to their father. And like I said, I just really loved this book. Emily Winfield Martin does the illustrations herself, and I've showed them off every time I talk about this book, but they are just absolutely beautiful. I really love the way, I really love her style and the way that she illustrates. I really enjoyed the atmosphere of this book, this a little bit creepy but really beautiful and magical setting of this forest. I also really liked the characters. Rose I think I loved more from the beginning than Snow, just because personality wise I am much more of a Rose than I am a Snow. But I still did really like Snow, and especially as the book went on I started to understand her a little better, and I really loved their relationship with each other, like the sister bond they have, and the way that they always try and help each other, they always try and get each other out of trouble. And the way that they're very different people, but one of the things that is the same is that they really love each other. And I also really liked the story itself of this book, and the way that it kind of plays into and also plays against fairy tale logic. And I think part of this is because I don't really know the story of Snow White and Rose Red. One of the things this book says, there's even a line on the back that says Snow and Rose didn't know they were living in a fairy tale. People never do. And I feel like that's such a good way to encapsulate this book, because it feels like people who got put into a fairy tale who were ordinary people and who don't realize they're in a story. So I really liked the way that when things would happen, sometimes you could apply fairy tale logic and sometimes you couldn't. There were a couple of times where I got frustrated because I was like, oh, they're obviously making the wrong choice here based on what we know from fairy tales and how characters tend to be written about in stories in general. And then it turns out that I was wrong. So I actually really liked that. I gave Snow and Rose 4.5 stars. Next I finished The Voice That Won the Vote, How One Woman's Words Made History by Elisa Boxer. And this is a very short picture book all about the final vote that finally decided that women would be allowed to vote in the United States. And because this is a picture book, I don't want to say too much, but I really loved this. I liked the kind of soft watercolor style of the illustrations. I really liked the story, and I also want to mention, so when I went to review this book on Goodreads, there's not that many reviews, and also some of the ones that were there were very some people seem to be very angry about what this book was doing, the fact that it told this one specific story about the fight for women's suffrage. This book sets out to tell a specific story, and I don't think it's fair to criticize it for doing what it said it was going to do. This book never intended to be a wide range picture of the entire fight for women to vote. And I understand the reviewers' frustration about reducing this whole fight to one event, but I don't really feel like that's what this book did. I mean, I actually didn't know the story until I watched a Bad Romance parody that was about women's suffrage. I will link that down below. It's actually excellent. It is so well done. The production quality and the cleverness of the writing and everything. I didn't know about this story until I watched that music video several years ago. And so while there is this huge long history of women fighting for their rights and fighting for the right to vote, I don't think it takes away from that to tell the story of one vote that did in fact change a lot. There are points of the story where one decision makes a huge difference, and I think that's what this book was telling. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. I personally didn't feel like this book was saying that the entire fight was this one decision. I think this book's intention was to tell a very little known story about how one man's vote and a letter from his mother really did help shape the course of history after all of the work that women had been doing for a very long time. Next I finished Wild Embers, Poems of Rebellion, Fire and Beauty by Nikita Gill. This is a book of poetry. I think some of these are considered prose poems. Again, I still don't exactly know what a prose poem is, but this is a poetry collection, and this is the third that I have read from Nikita Gill, and I think, even though I did enjoy it, I think this is my least favorite that I've read so far. Again, not that it was bad, but I really enjoyed Fierce Fairy Tales, and then I absolutely loved Great Goddesses. I think my favorite poems of Nikita Gill's were the ones near the very beginning of this book, about the beauty of the universe and galaxies, and something that I really love that she does is, I think a lot of poets, when they write about about the universe and about being like a small part of the universe. They take it in a very negative direction, like a you don't matter because the world is so large kind of thing. And when Nikita Gill writes about it, it's like a sense of wonder and a sense of beauty, and like you do matter, like you are so small but you are still a part of this magnificent universe and galaxy. And so that's something I really enjoy. I think those poems were absolutely beautiful. And then some of my other favorites, where she did ones on kind of like fairy tale princesses or Disney princesses, kind of rewriting their stories a little bit. Like I really loved the one she did with Belle. There were other poems that I loved throughout this, but I think the reason I didn't love this one quite as much is that something I noticed a little in Fierce Fairy Tales, and something that I didn't notice hardly at all in Great Goddesses, which is her most recent collection, is that I feel like sometimes in Gale's poetry, she has a tendency to have this very like fairy tale feeling style, and then right smack in the middle there will be a phrase or a sentence or a couple of lines that's like very modern phrasing. It's very jarring. And I feel like in this collection there were more of those times than in either of her others that I have read. But that being said, I did still really enjoy this, and I gave Wild Embers 3.5 stars. Next I finished Summerkin by Sarah Prineas. This is the second book in the Winterling trilogy, and this is a like somewhere between middle grade and young adult series that involves kind of like forest creatures or fae or elves, kind of, but they're not really any of those things. And our main character is a girl named Fur, short for Jennifer. And in the first book, she finds out that she can travel between the human world and this other kind of magical fairy world. So after the events of the first book, in the second one, she is kind of forced to prove that she belongs here, that she is allowed to stay in this other world where she feels like she belongs. And as a result, she has to compete in this competition, going up against other people who actually are from this world in order to prove that she deserves to be here. And another important character we have is a puck named Rook, and pucks are interesting because they're like these mischievous, again, kind of like fey creatures. They actually really remind me of Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream in some ways, which I think they're supposed to. And him and Fur have this kind of tentative friendship starting in the first book. And then in Summerkin, it's much more about Rook deciding if he's going to kind of ally himself with her or if he's going to stay loyal to his Puck brothers, which the bonds between Pucks are like very tight-knit. They don't really think kindly on outsiders, and I really, really enjoyed this book. I mentioned when I reviewed the first one that even though I enjoyed that one, I had a feeling I would like the other books even more, and so far that is definitely true. I really enjoyed the plot of this one. Like, magical contests are things that I never think I care about that much, but then when they're in a book, I tend to really enjoy them. So even though there were other things going on, like the contest didn't take over the story or anything, those trials I think were really interesting and really well done. And I think they were a great way to show Fur's character too, because a lot of the decisions she makes are like very indicative of who she is as a person. We have several side characters introduced who I really, really enjoyed in this book. I think Sarah Prineas is really good at getting you attached to side characters very quickly. I really liked the complexity of Rook and Fur's relationship, and I also am impressed because that plotline is something I can get very frustrated with. Like if we have like a later book in a series and we have two characters who were like allies or eventually kind of grudging friends before, then all of a sudden the conflict is like, wait, but do I actually trust you or not? I can find that very irritating, but the way it was done in this book felt very believable. I love the fact that we see more of the healing and herb magic that Fur has. I just really enjoyed that. And I also really liked, which I guess is similar to what I said about Snow and Rose, is I couldn't always see what the right decision was for Fur. Actually, there were several times where she did something and I got really annoyed at her because I'm like, obviously this is not the right thing to do because in stories you never do something like this. And then things would happen where I'm like, wait, maybe she was right? And again, for somebody who tends to guess like plots in books a lot, that was really exciting for me. So I really enjoyed Summerkin. I gave it 4 stars. Next I finished What the Wind Knows by Amy Harmon. Thank you to my friend Olivia for giving this to me for my birthday. This is a historical fiction kind of like time slip romance a little bit. We follow our main character named Anne Gallagher, and after the death of her grandfather who she grew up with, she's really devastated and she goes to Ireland to spread his ashes there, which was his last wish. And while she's there, she gets pulled back in time to Ireland in 1921, so like right in the middle of the fight for the Irish Free State. This is just a few years after the Easter Rising. Like, political tensions in Ireland are very, very high. And apparently she bears a really striking resemblance to this other woman who went missing a few years ago. So she kind of ends up taking on this woman's identity, and this woman had a son. And so she kind of is like pretending to be this boy's mother while trying to figure out how she got transported back, like what's going on. And then she starts forming a close bond and relationship with the guardian of this little boy, who is a doctor named Thomas Smith, and Thomas ends up getting very involved in the fight for Ireland's independence. And this was a really, really wonderful book. I ended up loving this one. I really like the way Amy Harmon writes. She's really good at situating you in a time period and in a place, and she's also really great at character relationships. And then one of my favorite things about this book was the setting and the history and the way that you felt completely immersed in Ireland in 1921. And even before I had read the author's note, I felt like, you know, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not Irish, but it felt like this was a very well-researched book from what I could tell. And then especially after reading the author's note, I think that's true because Amy Harmon talks about how she has Irish ancestry, and so she kind of like drew on like her own family lore in addition to doing all this research and everything. So, you know, even though Amy Harmon is American, it feels like, at least to me, this was a very grounded book, like very grounded in Irish history. And I love the way that Amy Harmon could connect you so immediately to this time period and to what was going on. Like, Anne, the main character, actually has a moment of like realizing that she's getting caught up in these events and she's like on the edge of her seat, even though she knows from the future, she knows what happens or what doesn't happen, but she's still like so pulled into wondering what is going to happen. And I feel like that's kind of how I felt as the reader, is like, even though I knew how certain things would go, it's like you were so invested. Like the setting and the conflict of Ireland trying to get their independence felt so immediate. Actually, one of my favorite characters ended up being Mick, or Michael Collins, who was very important in the struggle for Ireland's independence, but who I don't remember ever learning about before. And he was just such an interesting character, like the things that he was willing to do and how he sometimes did bad things for good reasons, and like seeing him struggle with that I thought was just really interesting. And then I also really loved the themes in this book about love of many different kinds and family and like people finding each other again. Like, it was just so beautiful. Like, there's this one little bit at the end of the book related to letters that I just, like, it really hit me. And then the only real like complaints I had with this book actually related to the romance between Anne and Thomas, which I did still enjoy. I'm not saying it was bad, but I think I actually would have preferred if there were a little more angst in the relationship, which is not something I always say. I'm very particular about angsty romance, but I just kind of wish there had been more internal conflict before they became involved. I think that would have made their romance more exciting, but it also would have made sense for the story. Like, maybe if Thomas still felt guilty about being involved with her because she was the wife of his best friend, you know, because he doesn't know that she is actually this woman from the future. Or maybe like he does find out that she's from the future and then he doesn't want to get involved because he knows she could go, like she could disappear at any time or something like that. Like, there were like small, I think, stumbling blocks with their relationship. Like, some of these things did come up, but not in a way that felt really significant to me. Or another way that it could have happened is like if Anne wasn't sure if she wanted to stay in this time period or go back to her home time. Because that was the only other complaint I had with this book. Is one of the things that I really love, that I've talked about really loving about this kind of time slip premise, is the inherent struggle you get with the main character of being torn between two times and two sets of people that they're close to. And with this book, you know from pretty early on that Anne would rather stay in the past. So there's still a struggle of like, is she going to go back to the future? Like, does she have a choice? But I think it took a lot of the conflict out of this book because we knew that Anne wanted to stay in the past. Like, she wasn't torn, and I think it would have made it more exciting, both for the relationship but also for the book in general, if she had truly been uncertain about which one she would do. But even with that being said, I absolutely love this book. I gave What the Wind Knows 4 stars, and I think it's kind of funny that like what drew me to this book was the like romantic time slip premise, but what I really loved about it was like the setting and the history and the themes and all of that. Next, I finished The Water Horse by Holly Webb. This is the first book in a middle grade fantasy series, and this is set in a fantasy version of Venice. And this ended up being such a pleasant surprise for me because I didn't know much about the story of this book. All I kind of knew about it is that it's about a young girl who makes friends with a magical water horse or something. And that is true, but there's so much more going on. Right off the bat, like the book starts out with Olivia, our main character, who's a young girl. I don't know exactly her age, with her realizing that her aunt has been essentially mind controlling her for her whole life. And she's like starting to wake up from that and to look around and realize that things are getting really bad. Her father, who she loves very much, is very sick. The waters in Venice are rising, and her father is actually responsible for doing the magic that keeps the floods from like overtaking the city. So she's scared for him, she's scared for the city. It seems like people in Venice are like starving, like they don't have enough food. And she's starting to see signs of all this poverty and suffering that she didn't know about before, that people kind of kept her from. And so like all of that on top of realizing that she's been controlled for pretty much her whole life. So like that's pretty dark. And I think that undercurrent of darkness is one of the things I really enjoyed about this book, which sounds kind of creepy to say, but it just made the stakes feel very real, and I really appreciated that. Olivia as a main character, I really liked her arc and her growth, because at the beginning she's pretty spoiled and selfish, and you understand why she is because, again, of the like mind control and like the way she's grown up and being kept from all signs that other people are not well off and all of that. But there's also a good amount of responsibility there. Like she realizes that she still should have been kinder to her maid, for example. I also really liked the setting. I just enjoy Italian-based fantasy in general, and I really liked this magical version of Venice. I really liked the magic in general, actually. And the water horse characters, they were really, really fun. So like there was definitely some lightness in this story. The only thing I didn't really like is the ending was a little fast for my taste, but overall I really enjoyed this, and I gave the water horse 4 stars. Next, I finished Henry and Fanny by Sherwood Smith. This is a like novella, I think, length story. It's basically an alternate ending for Mansfield Park. And as I mentioned in my currently reading update, Mansfield Park is a book that I love and appreciate more every time I read it, but also every time I read it, I like the ending less. So I ended up reading this book to see kind of how Sherwood Smith would reinterpret things, and I really enjoyed this one overall. I really liked the writing, like the cleverness, and like some of the sentence structure felt very similar to Jane Austen while also being like Sherwood Smith's own style and everything. And I also think the writing got better as the story went on, which, not that it was bad to begin with, but I think that as you got further into the story, she really seemed to settle into like her exact blend of like her style and Jane Austen's style. I also really liked the way that we got to see both of these characters grow separately based on who they were in Mansfield Park and things that did happen in Mansfield Park, but just kind of following certain choices in a different direction, I guess. I also really liked the way some of the other characters were developed. Like, this story made me not hate Edmund, which is pretty amazing. And I also really liked the way that Mary Crawford was developed in this story. Like, she actually surprised me quite a bit. I think Sherwood Smith really capitalized on the potential that the Crawfords had in Mansfield Park. I only had a few complaints with the story, and most of them are just personal preference. Like, the first one is there's a section in the middle that is letters from Fanny's brother who's at sea to her, and they were very well done, very accurate. Super boring though, because I don't care about ships really. But those were pretty short, so it wasn't a big deal. And then another thing is I would have actually liked more scenes between the two main characters, because while I did really love the individual like character arcs that both of them took, I really, really enjoyed the scenes they had together near the end of the story, and I wish that we had gotten like even more of those. It was like I wanted more of a good thing. There were some places during Fanny's arc where she kind of ended up not blaming herself exactly, but she was realizing that certain choices that she made, like she kind of told herself she was doing it for a good reason, and in fact she wasn't. And most of those, I think that was a really thoughtful like exploration. Like, I think those were fine. But there was just maybe 1 or 2 places where it felt like she was like she felt responsible for somebody else's poor decision because of something she had done. And I don't think that was fair. I don't think she should have felt responsible for that. But that was a very minor complaint because it happened very, very briefly, and I don't even necessarily think we were supposed to feel like she was at fault. I gave Henry and Fanny 4 stars. I think if you're somebody who is really, really happy with the way Mansfield Park ends, you probably wouldn't enjoy the story. But I think if you are dissatisfied with it, or if you see potential in some of the antagonists in that book, I think you could really enjoy this one. Like, I don't even necessarily think you have to be fans of those characters in order to enjoy the story. I think if you're just like open to being surprised. Next, I finished Callum Spell book by Tracy West. And this is a tie-in graphic novel-ish type thing related to the Dragon Prince TV show, which is on Netflix, and it's one of my favorite shows. I absolutely love it. First, I want to mention that if you're not caught up with the show, so if you haven't seen, I would say up through the end of season 3, you probably shouldn't read this because there are spoilers in it. So just know that going in. But I just think this book did a lot of things really well. Like, I don't think it felt like just a cash grab. First off, I think it was really useful. Like, I watched every season as it came out, and I have rewatched the earlier seasons, I think once or twice. But you know, like, as you watch a show as it's being released, I think you can sometimes forget details or not really connect them to each other in certain ways. So I really liked the actual like informational sections about explaining like the different kingdoms and how the magic works and all of this, because a lot of it was just review, but there were a couple of connections where I don't remember if I understood the significance of certain things that happened in the show, or if I had forgotten those maybe, so that was really helpful. This was also just a really fun and funny book. I think they really captured the tone of the show, and like some of my favorite parts were like seeing the way that characters were portrayed in this, because it kind of starts out as Callum's journal, So you kind of get to see like some of the characters' personalities and everything coming through. I also think it was cool that we get some hints that I think are of things to come in future seasons. Like, I do think there is some material in here that you couldn't get from the show, which is kind of nice. And I also liked just the general design and style. Let me see if I can find one that doesn't spoil anything. But yeah, just the way this was put together, I really enjoyed the art and animation in the show, so I did kind of expect to enjoy that. But I just had a lot of fun with this. The only thing that I wish this book would have done is I wish we had gotten even more of the character stuff. Those were some of my favorite parts, is when we felt like we really saw the personalities of the characters from the show, and I absolutely love this group of characters, so I would have loved even more of that. I think if you're a fan of the show, I would definitely recommend it, and I gave Callum Spell book 4.5 stars. Next, I finished The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is the second book in the Lord of the Rings series, and this is our continuing buddy read that I have with Vendi, Kelsey, and Katie, and I am still loving this. I'm not sure how much to summarize about this book, but basically this is split into two chunks. So we're following like Aragorn and gang, and we're following Frodo and Sam and their continuing journey. I was actually kind of like mentally preparing myself for this book to be kind of a slog, because at least in the movies, I never enjoyed the journey parts with Frodo and Sam as much as I did the other stuff. But once I got to that section of the book, I actually like flew through it. Like, I really enjoyed the earlier parts too, but I just found this a much more compelling book than I thought I would. It's almost like reading them for the first time again, because again, I remember so little of this from the first time I read this series when I was like 9. I feel like I'm rediscovering favorite characters all over again. Like, Faramir has some wonderful scenes in this, and I just feel like those scenes overall were a really nice reprieve from the kind of darkness of that chunk of the story. Frodo and Sam are just wonderful characters, and I knew I loved Sam, like, he's wonderful. But again, as I said with Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo might be the biggest surprise of this series for me so far, because I just love him. He's like one of my favorite characters, I think. And again, not that I didn't like him in the movies. I think Elijah Wood did a great job with him. But I think all of the things I love about Frodo are things that you really can't show in a visual format. Like his thoughts and his wishes, and like those little, like the little like internal personality things, I guess. Like, he's so brave and good and like smart, and I just love him and admire him so much. I also really love the Ents. Like, we get to see the Ents a lot in this book, so like those magical forest vibes are just great. Also really enjoy Merry and Pippin, and I feel like I have wronged them for many years by kind of thinking they were idiots, because like, I think the movies, while I love the movies, they kind of play up the like silliness or like them making dumb choices, whereas in the books, they're not that dumb. Like, yeah, they make one or two pretty like significant bad choices in this book, but even that, it's like very understandable, and it was like not nearly to the extent of what I was picturing them in the movies as like constantly just screwing up. So yeah, I'm also like really enjoying Merry and Pippin, just like the characters in general. I still love the writing. I still love the way that Tolkien can create a scene's atmosphere so wonderfully, because that's the thing that I think it's one of the things that makes me not feel like his writing does bog me down, even though it is very like dense and descriptive and everything. I think the reason it doesn't bother me like some other writers do is because it feels done for a purpose. Like, you really get a clear picture of what this area looks like, and more importantly, what it feels like. Like, the way he can describe like a field or like a swamp or something and make you feel this very particular kind of like fear and disgust and a little pity, and just like that whole like atmosphere, or the way that he can describe, like, as he introduces a new character, it's like you get this sense of who they are so clearly because he's so specific with his word choice. I don't know if any of that made sense. But basically, I'm still loving the series, and I gave The Two Towers 5 stars. Next, I finished Game of Stars by Tinytest Gupta. This is the second book in the Kiranmala and the Kingdom Beyond series, and I buddy read this with my lovely friend Julia from Shakespeare and Such. This is a middle grade fantasy adventure series inspired by Indian mythology, and I really enjoyed the first book, and so this second book is kind of, obviously it's following on from the events of the first one, and basically our main character Kiranmala, who has learned that she is a part of this mythological world. In this book, she gets drawn into a magical competition, and in this book we kind of have a different villain threat than we did in the first one. Sort of different. It's hard to explain. So I was kind of disappointed in this book compared to the first one, which I really enjoyed. Part of it was the plot and the story. Like, the plot for this one felt kind of all over the place. Like, it took a while to get to the magical competition, which was kind of, it seemed like was supposed to be the main point of this book. And I did enjoy those scenes, but that was really barely in the book in favor of other plot stuff. But then that plot stuff, with the way the book ends and how it looks like the third book is going to continue, it seems like even that even those plot elements didn't end up really mattering. So that's kind of why this book felt like filler to me. And also, like, I almost never notice pacing problems. It's just not something I care about. But even I felt like this book was kind of weirdly paced. There were some things we spent a lot of time on, and then some things that, again, were barely in the book that were supposed to be important. Like, we spent multiple chapters with Kieran Mala, like, registering, like, doing paperwork to register for this competition. And while that might be realistic, it wasn't terribly interesting. On the positive side, I continue to really enjoy the way that Indian mythology is worked into this story and into this world. I also want to mention, if you guys are somebody who doesn't normally read author's notes, I always tend to read them, so I sometimes forget to mention it. But I would really recommend reading the author's notes for this book, because Tinytest Gupta goes into specific traditions and stories that she draws on. And there were several places where a certain scene that I wondered like why it was included or why it was done in a certain way, it directly ties into a particular story that Das Gupta was drawing on, or a tradition or some part of Indian culture or mythology, which I thought was really cool. So definitely highly recommend reading those author's notes. I also feel like the writing and the humor was less fun in this book. It seemed like there was a lot more of the like snot and burping and that kind of humor, which there definitely was some in the first book, but I think in this book it happened a lot more. And before anybody says like, oh, it's because it's for a younger audience, I just want to mention not all middle grade books have that kind of humor. And even when I was a middle grader, I didn't like that kind of humor. So I don't think this is just because I'm an adult reading this. It just felt like kind of forced, in addition to being something that I just personally don't enjoy. And then speaking of personal enjoyment, I was also super bummed because my favorite character from the first book was barely in this one. So that also made it just less enjoyable. I am going to continue the series. I feel like the third one will fix a lot of the problems I had with this one. But I ended up giving Game of Stars 3 stars. Next, I finished Rapunzel's Revenge by Shannon and Dean Hale, illustrated by Nathan Hale. And this is, of course, a Rapunzel retelling. It's the first in a duology. And this is a graphic novel. And even though I mentioned how I was kind of bummed because I really liked the cover style and it was slightly different from the inside, I do want to say that the art inside ended up really growing on me quite a bit. I ended up really enjoying it. So in this story, we follow our main character Rapunzel, and as is pretty typical with those retellings, she starts out being locked up in a tower for a while, not for her whole life, but a long time. And so when she finally gets out, she's very sheltered. And the whole story is about her trying to find her birth mother. That's one of the only criticisms I had of this volume, actually, is that there was some language used to refer to like her trying to find her real mother as opposed to her adopted mother. So that wasn't great. I mean, it was pretty clear from the context that it's because her mother Gothel, she was a terrible person. Like, it wasn't, I don't think this book was like downplaying the importance of adoptive parents. I think it was just in this particular case, but I do want to mention that language. Pretty much everything else though I really loved about this story. I really liked Rapunzel as a main character. She is very naive at the beginning, but it makes sense, and I think that's why it didn't bother me. She's not frustrating about it because you know that there's a reason for it and you can see her developing throughout the story. I also really like Jack, who was kind of the other main character. He was a lot of fun, and something I was really impressed with this graphic novel with is the comic timing of the dialogue. Like, I'm still pretty new to graphic novels, but I feel like it's very rare for me to specifically notice the writing and how much I'm enjoying the writing. And for this one, I definitely did. Like, the humor was great, and like I said, just the way that Shannon Hale and the artists could communicate comic timing in a graphic novel format was just super impressive to me. I also thought the Wild West setting was really fun. Wild West kind of fantasy setting. There's a little bit of a romance that I really enjoyed. And I also think it's funny how, like, in recent years, a lot of Rapunzel retellings seem to be playing off of the Rapunzel and Flynn Rider dynamic, like from Tangled, and I'm not mad at it. I just tend to really enjoy that. So I had a great time with this, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I finished Bold and Brave, 10 Heroes Who Won Women the Right to Vote by Kirsten Gillibrand and art by Myra Kalman. And this is a picture book that I have shown a little bit before. I really enjoyed the art style and the whole, like, the design of this book, and basically it's what it sounds like, where it's 10 different women who are all very important in the fight for women to get the right to vote. And something I really appreciated about this book is how intersectional it is, not just in the variety of women that were included, which is appropriate, seeing as women of color were incredibly important in the fight for getting women the right to vote, and are too often left out of history. But that also came through in the way that the individual women's accomplishments were described. A lot of them, it pointed out like other social justice issues they were involved with, and I think even though I don't remember them using the word intersectional, I feel like that really speaks to the importance of feminism and all of these different movements being linked together. Like all of these are human issues, and I think this book did a really good job of showing that. And this is intended for children, so I think that's a great way to introduce them to this concept. And because there's only 10 of them, I'm just going to run through the different women in this book. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Jovita Idar, Alice Paul, Inez Milholland, Ida B. Wells, Lucy Burns, and Mary Church Terrell. And just as an example of what I was talking about earlier, Jovita Idar, her write-up included the fact that she was really instrumental in the fight against violence inflicted on Mexican Americans. They showed multiple causes that these women were involved in. The only real criticism that I have for this book is that the individual entries on the women were, I think, a little too short. I know it is in the format of a picture book and it is supposed to be kind of a brief overview, but I think even considering that, I think it would have been nice to have just a little bit more information about these women and about their work. But that being said, I still think this was really fantastic, and I gave Bold and Brave 4.5 stars. Next, I finished The Stolen Kingdom by Bethany Atazadeh. This is a fairy tale retelling inspired by the story of Aladdin, and our main character is a princess named Ari, and in this world there are things called Jinni's gifts. So there are Jinni or genies in this world, but these gifts are things that humans sometimes get, and you definitely don't want them. Basically, if it's found out that somebody has a Jinni gift, they get in trouble, they can be imprisoned, and they can actually sometimes die for it, because especially if women are found out to have a gift, they have this like operation or ceremony performed where it removes the gift from them, and they always end up dead. And so our main character Ari thinks that these women are being murdered. She has a Jinni's gift, so she's very afraid about people finding that out. And the book starts when a neighboring king wants to marry her, and if she were to go along with this, it would mean her kingdom would end up in the hands of a terrible person. So she doesn't want this to happen, so she runs away. And she ends up falling in with this man named Caden and his kind of band of thieves, and it turns out that they have been trying to capture a Jinni. So Ari ends up going along with them because she thinks if she can find a Jinni, then she can convince him to remove her gift from her so that people can't catch her. And Ari's gift is that she's able to read people's thoughts, but only when those thoughts are about or focused on her. And I had somewhat mixed feelings about this book. Overall, I liked it, and I am definitely excited to continue the series. This is kind of one of those ones, like I've mentioned before, where, especially because it's a companion series, I feel like I liked the first book, but I'm going to really enjoy the later books. I'll start out with the things that I wasn't as much of a fan of and end on a positive note. The romance in this book didn't really do anything for me. I didn't think that Ari and Caden had very much chemistry, and I also feel like the plot of this one was a little bit boring. I don't know, it felt like we spent a lot of time on things that should have been glossed over. Just like there were a lot of things involving those characters and like Caden's gang of thieves and like their plan to find a Jinni. There was a lot of time spent on the boring parts of that rather than the parts of that plot that I think would have been more interesting. And I think part of that is just because, again, I wasn't that attached to the characters or their relationships. Even some of the side characters, like Caden's whole band of thieves, I had to keep reminding myself which was which because they all kind of felt like they only had one defining personality trait. And then also Ari is a main character I had kind of mixed feelings about. I actually liked her at the beginning. I appreciated the scary position that she was in. But after the opening scenes in the palace, after she runs away, I got really frustrated with her. She got better by the end because, like I mentioned with Rapunzel, I don't actually mind having a main character who is a little bit naive, or even a lot naive. And even though I'm definitely very picky with main characters, that is I guess, failing that I find more forgivable if I understand why the character is that way. And usually also if I can see that there's going to be character development, that also helps. But the frustrating thing with Ari is I didn't really understand why she was doing the things, like the naive things that she was doing, because yes, she has been very privileged. She's grown up in this palace, but the frustrating part was she would recognize what she was supposed to do or what would be the smart thing to do, and then she would continuously make a different choice, like the wrong choice. Like for example, she is very aware the entire time through this book that she can't let people know that she can read minds because that's like a Jinni gift and she would get in trouble for that. Her life would be in danger. So she logically figures out that she has to train herself not to react to other people's thoughts about her because that would give away that she can hear their thoughts, which makes sense. But every single time she thinks that, immediately after that, she reacts to somebody's thoughts about her. Some of the side characters I actually did enjoy, like Gideon and what's her name? I think Rena. I found them some of the most interesting characters in this book, and I'm really excited about the second book because that is a Little Mermaid retelling that follows them. That's another thing I really enjoyed about this book is the setting and the world and the magic and the magical creatures, because it also looks like there are mermaids in this world in addition to Jinni. And I also feel like the Jinni lore was really, really interesting. And I also feel like this book was surprisingly, I don't know, it's almost like stealth feminist a little bit, because there were quite a few small references throughout the book to the fact that like men who have the Jinni's gift could argue their way out of being punished for it, but if women were found to have it, they were always put on trial and it was not a fair trial and they ended up having their gift taken from them and then they ended up dead. And I just think it was very interesting that throughout the book we see these inklings of Ari realizing, or Ari already knowing, that the treatment of powerful men and powerful women is not the same. So that was another thing I enjoyed. So like I said, I did like this. I gave this Rolling Kingdom 3 stars, but I do think I'm going to enjoy the later books more. Next, I finished Once Upon an Eid, Stories of Hope and Joy by 15 Muslim Voices, edited by S.K. Ali and Aisha Saeed. And I absolutely loved this collection. As you can tell, these are a collection of stories from a variety of different authors and about different characters from various Muslim backgrounds, the different race or ethnicity or experience. I love the variety of stories in here. Like, quite a few of them are very like sweet and heartwarming, but there are also several that deal with some really heavy topics. I'm also going to link Sasha's video down below because he did a really fantastic like review or recommendation or like reasons to read video that is just absolutely wonderful. So if you want to hear more about why you should pick this book up, definitely go watch that video. I'm just going to look at my notes and like mention some of my favorites real quick. Perfect by Jamilah Thompkins-Bigelow. That one I really enjoyed. Yusuf and the Great Big Brownie Mistake by Aisha Saeed. That one was really fun. Donut Break Tradition by S.K. Ali was absolutely incredible. That was the first story in the collection that like brought tears to my eyes, which is perhaps unsurprising because I love S.K. Ali's books. Just Like Chest Armor by Candice Montgomery was absolutely beautiful. That's about a young girl being excited to wear hijab for the first time. Gifts by Roxana Khan and The Feast of Sacrifice by Hanna Khan. I really enjoyed both of those as well. Searching for Blue by N.H. Senzai, that one was incredible. That one was one of the heavier ones because it dealt with refugee camps and grief and civil war and trauma, and it was all just done in such a thoughtful way. And they absolutely loved Taste by Hanna Alkaf. That one is a story in verse, and it is just the most gorgeous and heart-wrenching thing. That's another one that deals with grief and especially with guilt. And oh my gosh, it was just stunning. I think I'll have to check out some of Hanna Alkaf's other work because that was one of my favorite stories in the collection. And then the other story in verse was Eat Pictures, which was also by Jamilah Thompkins-Bigelow. And that one was really short, but it really packed a punch. And yeah, there were even more stories that I really enjoyed. I think only 2 of them out of the 15 stories got below a 4 stars, and those were still 3.5 stars. So this is just absolutely wonderful. I cannot recommend it enough. I'll link my Goodreads updates down below if you want to know the individual ratings I gave all the stories. But if I average those together, this works out to about 4.5 stars. Whether you are Muslim or not, I think this is a beautiful short story collection. And actually the editors have notes where they talk about how they want this to be for young Muslim kids or Muslim readers of all ages to be able to see themselves, but also for people who are not Muslim, like I myself am not Muslim. It's a really wonderful opportunity to get some insight into this holiday that I think a lot of non-Muslim people don't know a lot about, and just to get to see some characters who are different from you. I just thought this was absolutely beautiful, and it was actually really cool because while I was reading this, I was thinking about that quotation by Rudine Sims Bishop, which is about middle grade or children's books being windows and mirrors. So kids should have an opportunity to see themselves like in a mirror, but also to get a glimpse of other people who are not like them, so they can also function as windows. And I was thinking about that while reading this book, and then in their end note, they actually mentioned that quotation or that description specifically, and that's what they hoped this book would be. So I definitely think it was, and like I said, just please pick it up. It was wonderful. Next, I finished The Wolf Princess by Catherine Constable, and in the story we follow a young girl named Sophie, and she goes to a boarding school in England, and she's always dreamed of winter and Russia and this almost like fairy tale feeling of Russian history and culture and stories. And then one day, her and her 2 friends from school, I think their names are Delphine and Marianne, they all get stuck in a blizzard and they end up getting rescued by Princess Anna Volkonskaya and taken to her palace. And it's basically just like Sophie has always dreamed of. It's this beautiful fairy tale world, and Sophie is just enchanted by it. But as time goes on, she starts to realize that something sinister might be going on here and that things aren't what they seem. And this was a very strange book. I really liked it overall, but it was very different than what I expected, even though I don't know what I expected going in. I really liked the writing in this book. It had a really great balance of good dialogue and clever descriptions, and also really communicating that atmospheric setting, like the beauty of that. Something kind of interesting is the print is actually in like dark blue or like indigo or something, so that I guess also contributed to the wintry feeling. And I also really liked the characters in this book. Like Sophie and Marianne and Delphine, like I just really loved their friendship, and even though Marianne and Delphine kind of feel like stereotypical characters at the beginning, because Delphine is the glamorous, beautiful one who's obsessed with like pretty dresses and things like that, and Marianne is the very bookish one who doesn't care about any of that. They feel kind of stereotypical at the beginning, but as the book goes on, you get a little more nuance to them, and just the characters in general I think were very compelling. Like the side characters were really well drawn. Princess Anna's character was also very interesting because you kind of understood where Sophie was coming from, why she was like kind of enchanted by her but also a little bit frightened. I did have kind of a problem with some of the way that culture was discussed in this book. Like, it kind of felt like when Russian history or culture was discussed, it was either like very comical to the point of being a little bit like ridiculous or making fun of, or it was this very like noble and beautiful and fairy tale kind of feeling. But as the book went on, I started thinking that maybe that was intentional, because part of the story is about the differences between what Sophie thinks Russia is and what Russia actually is. I don't know if I'm describing this well at all, but basically I maybe had a few issues with the way that different languages or different accents or things were kind of depicted or even made fun of, but I do think that that ultimately was kind of the point of the book, so make of that what you will. I also think it was very weird that I think this was set in the modern day world, because like characters have cell phones and things like that, but a lot of this book felt like almost timeless, especially because it relied so heavily on that fairy tale atmosphere and feeling. I actually think that contrast worked in the book's favor most of the time, but that was something that kind of threw me. And then the other thing I wasn't a big fan of is the ending of this book. There were some things I really liked about it and some things that I felt very unsatisfied by. So I have kind of mixed feelings about the end of this book too. So overall, I did enjoy The Wolf Princess. I ended up giving it 3.75 stars, and I would definitely recommend it if it sounds interesting, but yeah, it was just a very odd experience, but mostly a positive one. Next, I finished Night of the Dragon by Julie Kagawa. This is the third and final book in the Shadow of the Fox trilogy, which is a trilogy inspired by Japanese folklore and mythology, and I have really been enjoying this series. The first book starts out with our main character Yumiko, who is half kitsune or half fox spirit, and she lives at a monastery, and after her monastery is destroyed, she's tasked with protecting the pieces of a scroll that every, I think, 1,000 years or 10,000 years can be used to summon the great kami dragon, and if somebody does summon the dragon, they can make any wish they want, and all of these wishes have generally gone very badly, and so Yumiko is tasked with protecting this scroll and not letting it fall into the wrong hands. And then our other main character, a shadow assassin kind of, named Tatsumi, and he's actually trying to find the pieces. So he and Yumiko team up. He doesn't know that Yumiko has the other part of the scroll. And then of course by the third book, there's a lot going on that I can't talk about for spoiler reasons. But as an ending to this trilogy, I really, really enjoyed this. I think it really went there. Like the emotional payoff of this book was, I think, really, really excellent. I think this would also be a great series for people who think that YA series never go far enough, especially in the finale. I think this book in this series is a really great example of how that's not true. I continue to really enjoy the characters, not just Yumiko and Tatsumi, but all of our like main cast of characters I really, really love. The only thing that didn't so much work for me in this book was some of the plot's focus on battles. That's like, battle scenes are just something I don't enjoy reading about. I don't find them very interesting, and it makes sense that this book would have a lot of them because of where we are in the plot, but I just feel like that made the plot aspects a little bit less compelling for me. But overall, I still thought this was a fantastic conclusion. I really recommend this series. I think this series is also a great example of how you can have very familiar fantasy tropes and they can still be really fun. Like, tropes are not bad things, and I feel like this series has a great balance of really leaning into those very familiar tropes in a way that is very enjoyable, and also Julie Kagawa really did some unusual and interesting things with the story as well. So I just think those things were really well balanced, and I gave Night of the Dragon 4 stars. Next, I finished The Lady and the Highwayman by Sarah M. Eden. This is a library book that I can actually show you for once because I have not had to return it yet, and also it's not covered in intensely shiny plastic, so I actually have a book to hold up. And this is a historical romance following two main characters. One of them is a man named Fletcher Walker, and he grew up very poor, kind of on the streets, and because of some lucky circumstances and people really making an effort to help him, he was able to become successful. He's no longer living in poverty, and he's made it his life's work to do the same for other children and just disadvantaged people in general. And the main way that he does that is he belongs to something called the Dread Penny Society, and basically it's a secret group made up of Penny Dreadful writers. If you don't know what Penny Dreadfuls are, they're like these very sensational stories that would come out in installments. Sometimes they would have like supernatural elements, sometimes they would be adventure stories. There were a lot of like outlaws and adventure and excitement. So Fletcher belongs to this group called the Dread Penny Society, which are a bunch of authors who write penny dreadfuls, and they use the proceeds to fund good works in the city of London. So they'll rescue women being forced into prostitution, they'll take care of hungry orphans, they will give schooling, they will also sometimes rescue children from slavery and keep them safe. So they do a lot of really important work related to taking care of people, especially the lower class people who get overlooked a lot. And then our other main character is Elizabeth Black, and she is secretly a penny dreadful writer. She does not belong to that society. She's a very proper headmistress of a school for kind of middle class girls, and as I mentioned, she secretly writes penny dreadfuls. and she's actually becoming the most popular Penny Dreadful author. Fletcher and the other Dread Penny members are realizing that there is this other mysterious Penny Dreadful writer named Mr. King, which is Elizabeth's alias, is suddenly the most popular writer, so he's making a lot more money, and Fletcher and the rest of this group are concerned that if they start losing the money that they get from these Penny Dreadfuls, they're not going to be able to help as many people. And so Fletcher ends up enlisting the help of Elizabeth to find out who Mr. King is, and Elizabeth goes along with it, thinking that she can kind of keep him off the scent. And then as the book goes on, they end up kind of working together in other ways as well. Much of it related to the good works that both of them are doing. So Elizabeth, her school is really, really important to her, and her Penny Dreadful writing is actually the way that she funds being able to take care of these girls. And I ended up really, really liking this. Like, the premise and the concept of this book, for one thing, are just something I love. Like, the idea of using book sales to fund social change and to take care of people who need it. I just love that idea, and I love the way that was executed here. One detail that I really loved is that Fletcher is continuously very aware of, and he talks about this to other people, of the fact that it wasn't that he worked harder than the other kids. He was also lucky, like he got opportunities that they didn't get, and so he wants to pass that on, those opportunities on to other people. And something that was really fun about this book is we actually get the stories that Mr. King and Fletcher are writing. So the book, of course, is called The Lady and the Highwayman, and you can see at the top of the page, it has the title of the book and the author, Sarah M. Eden, but then Elizabeth's story within the story is called The Lady and the Highwayman. So in her chapters, it says the title at the top and it says Mr. King as the author. And then Fletcher's story he's writing is called The Vampire's Tower. So then during those chapters where you read his story, it has Fletcher Walker listed as the author. And that's just a touch that I found really fun. And I just really enjoyed those sections from the story overall. Like, you could tell that Sarah M. Eden had just the best time writing those Penny Dreadfuls, and I feel like that really came through to the reader because I had fun reading those. And I also really loved the romance in this book that develops between Fletcher and Elizabeth. It was just really sweet and also really flirty. Like, they had a good balance of banter and just being really caring with each other. This is, I guess, considered a clean romance, which basically this is what I've been trying to find, because it has some of the story elements and the tropes that I'm interested in from adult historical romance, but no smut. And that was great for me because I really don't like reading smut. I could see that disappointing some people, but for me it was perfect. And I only had a couple things I didn't like about this book. One of them is I think that we took too long with the identity reveal, especially because as you're reading this book, we know that Fletcher and Elizabeth are both really good people and that they're both using these funds for good. So you know that if they confess the truth to each other, that they could like pool their resources and do even more good. So it was a little frustrating reading this story and knowing that they would be great working together and just having that not happen soon enough. And then also the writing and the historical elements I think could be a tiny bit heavy-handed at the beginning, although this got a lot better. It felt a little bit like it was trying too hard maybe with some of the dialogue and some of the slang and everything, especially at the beginning. But as the book went on, I think that smoothed out quite a bit, and I ended up really enjoying the writing of this actually. And then the historical element, I think this would actually be a really great book for people who are not sure they want to read historical fiction. They're just barely dipping their toes in. Because one thing that kind of frustrated me with this book is that there were certain like elements of the time period that were really over-explained. So I think that would make this a good kind of beginning book if people aren't familiar with historical fiction, or maybe they're not familiar with this time period in particular. But that was another element that I think got less grading as the book went on. I think Sarah M. Eden kind of eased up on that a little bit. So I just really ended up enjoying this book. I gave The Lady and the Highwayman 4 stars. Next, I finished our Austen Anonymous book for May, which was Emma by Jane Austen. We had Kier the Scrivener and Carrie the Book Bell join us. I will link our live show down below. And Emma, I have a lot of mixed feelings about this book. I think it's my least favorite Jane Austen actually, which, you know, my least favorite Jane Austen is still a novel I love. I love the writing as always. I love the humor. I think a lot of the side characters in this book really, really stand out. And I forgot how wonderful Mr. Knightley is as a love interest and a character. He's just a delight. And the romance in general was really good in this book, although I have some issues with the age gap and with how often they mention the age gap. But there were just a lot of things that bothered me about this book. Like, Emma as a main character, she is very interesting, and it's very impressive to me that Jane Austen could create such an like unlikable female main character who you still care about. But I think she's remained more unlikable for me than she was supposed to, because I just don't feel convinced by her character development. Like, I just don't feel like she really changed. I think maybe Emma has realized there are certain people she has to treat better, but her overall, I guess, principles, I don't feel like those actually changed at all, which really bothers me. I also really hate the way that Harriet's plotline, or like Emma's friendship with Harriet, is resolved at the end of this novel. That's something I noticed they always change in adaptations, and I really like that they changed that. I just hate the way that things are left with Harriet. And then speaking of the ending, this is a very, very long ending. Like, this is the only book of Jane Austen's that feels long to me. And I think that's because we have so much time after the, like, proposal moment. And I actually really like that we got romantic scenes after that. But I just feel like that ending chunk of the book, I feel like we could have still gotten some of those scenes while also not making the end drag as much. But that being said, like, this is still a fantastic novel. I still gave it 4 stars. I'm just very conflicted because I don't know if we're supposed to leave this book feeling the way I do. Like, if we're supposed to be upset about what happens to Harriet, if we're supposed to be questioning Emma's intentions at the end even. I had also forgotten quite a few plot things that happen in this book. Like, Frank Churchill's character, I think, was one of the most interesting parts to read about this time because I had forgotten a lot of what happens in the novel. Like, Jane Austen's novels in general lend themselves really, really well to rereads, and I feel like Emma is one that even more than some of the others does, because when you know certain things, the whole book reads different, and that's just very exciting. Or at least huge parts of the book read very differently. And the last book I read in May was The Boy in the Black Suit by Jason Reynolds. We follow our main character Matt, and his mother has just recently died, and he's really grief-stricken. He's having a hard time, and his father is not handling it well. He's starting to slide back into alcoholism. And then on top of this, Matt has to get a job, and because of some circumstances that happen, he ends up getting a job at a local funeral home. And Matt discovers that there is something that is very cathartic for him about working at this funeral home and being a part of these funeral services and everything. He realizes there's something very comforting about this for him because he gets to see other people experiencing the same kind of pain he is, and that makes his pain hurt a little bit less. And then he also ends up meeting a girl named Lovey, who he has a crush on, and so we see them spending time together. And Lovey also has some things in her past, and I just absolutely love this book. This was, I think, my favorite book I read during this month because it was just so powerful and so emotional, while also really balancing like the heavy topics it deals with these moments of lightness. I'm actually going to do a full spoiler-free review on this book. Hopefully that has already been posted. If it is, I will link it down below. But I just absolutely fell in love with this. The writing is fantastic. Jason Reynolds is so great at emotionally connecting you with characters, and with their relationships and with certain situations, while also having really funny dialogue moments. And I gave The Boy in the Black Suit 5 stars. Okay, everybody, so those are all the books that I read in May. Please let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!